BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, as the Climate Change Committee recommends an agricultural transformation, might daffodils help?
In terms of the overall methane yield, it was down by about 20%.
More on that later. First, fly tipping is on the up. The latest Environment Agency figures for England show more than 1 million incidents of rubbish being dumped on public land last year, up 6% from the year before. Those stats don't include fly tipping on farms. The Country Land and Business Association says in its latest survey, 90% of respondents had dealt with rubbish, from fridges to tyres, dumped on their land in the past year. Rural groups and councils are calling for tougher penalties for fly tippers. We've been reporting on this problem for years, and in particular, we've highlighted the issues faced by a community in Kent living near an illegal dump. With the latest is BBC South East Environment correspondent Yvette Austin.
I'm standing on the edge of some fields in North Kent, near the River Medway and its wildlife-rich marshes. But there's a blot on the landscape in front of me. A large field of churned up earth, piles of what looks like rubble and builder's waste, an old barn and some plant machinery. We launch our drone camera and see a digger loading waste into a trailer, which is then pulled across the wet ground by a tractor. The trailer then tips the waste into a trench. Legitimate waste disposal sites have a permit from the Environment Agency or an exemption from needing one. I've discovered this site has neither. Local people want the tipping stopped. We're protecting their identities, and their words are spoken by an actor.
It's not just what's happening to our area, it's the flies, the rubbish, the disease, the dirt.
It's continuing to cause a nuisance. Traffic is still there. It's just constant. Nothing is being done. They're acting with utter impunity.
We witnessed more worrying scenes in April last year. Large lorries tipping their loads directly into the ground. We showed our footage to the former head of the Environment Agency's National Crime Team, Andrew Hyam.
You can see from the nature of it, it doesn't appear to have been treated in any way that complies with environmental legislation. There could be carcinogenic stuff in there, there could be all sorts of stuff in there that is highly toxic and dangerous to handle. Even clinical waste could be in that, but it could be anything.
But I want to know where at least some of it is coming from, so I follow one of the empty lorries that had just tipped. OK, the red van's gone left, the lorry's gone right.
Follow the lorry.
It enters a skipyard where it's reloaded. Illegal waste dumping is a problem nationwide. Most of it's fly-tipped. Dan Cook is from the Chartered Institution of Wastes Management.
At the moment, waste crime costs us as a society in the UK over £1 billion a year. It undercuts the responsible operators out there, of which there are hundreds and thousands of people trying to do the right thing, trying to recycle better, trying to manage our waste better. So it's really important that we put pressure on these criminals and bring them to task as soon as we can.
A spokesman for the Environment Agency said,
Organised criminal groups target the waste industry by undercutting legitimate businesses and wreak havoc on our environment. Many of these criminals have international connections, using the waste industry to launder money and fuel other illegal activities. Our commitment is unwavering, and we're working across agencies to bring these criminals to justice and safeguard our environment.
So I'm thinking, if I want some waste taken away by anyone other than the local authority, how can I make sure that it won't end up somewhere like this? Because under the law, it's my responsibility, and I could be prosecuted if my waste is found here. I can check up online on the company I've booked to collect my waste, but it can then go through a chain of other handlers for processing, and government figures suggest nearly 20% of all waste operators are thought to engage in illegal activity. The government says it's working to force perpetrators to clean up their own mess. Meanwhile, we watch the lorry tip its load again.
That report from Yvette Austin. Greenhouse gas emissions from farming are highlighted in the latest recommendations from the Climate Change Committee, which we'll talk about in a moment. Because first, as part of our week looking at bulbs, we're going to talk about methane reduction. And yes, there is a link. An extract from daffodil bulbs is being added to cattle feed in a research project at SRUC, Scotland's Rural College, aimed at reducing emissions. They've called it Dancing with Daffodils, as Nancy Nicholson discovered when she went to meet Dr. Jamie Newbold, one of the leaders of the research team.
Jamie Newbold and I are just walking into the beef research unit on one of the college farms on the outskirts of Edinburgh, and the animals are incredibly quiet, Jamie, because they've just been fed.
Yeah, they're all quite happily munching away.
And presumably they're also emitting methane while they're doing that.
They do.
How do these daffodil bulbs help reduce emissions?
What we're working on is an extract from daffodils, amanthamine, that manipulate the rumen of the animal. So probably important to say that I don't recommend anybody feeds daffodil bulbs. I think they might have some dead cattle quite quickly. These cattle that we've got in front of us are probably 400 kilograms, and they'll have a rumen of about 80 litres, about the size of a domestic dustbin. In that rumen, there's a large amount of microbial fermentation, which is what allows these animals to use the things that you can see in front of them.
The silage.
Hay and silage. Yeah. Because the microbes in the rumen can ferment that, the animals can live off the products of the fermentation. One of the side effects of that fermentation is that methane is produced, which, as we know, is a troublesome greenhouse gas. And one of the big areas that SIUC is involved in is just trying to understand that fermentation so that we can decrease the amount of methane that's produced.
And do you have evidence that it does actually work? And does it also make an animal more efficient in the way it processes that food?
We've just completed our first very small animal trial with about 6 of these animals being fed glutamine. And we saw increases in the amount of food the animals ate, so they ate more, so they would have grown quicker, but with no increase in methane. So in terms of the overall methane yield, it was down by about 20%.
There has been a lot of consumer backlash recently against the feed additive Bovaer. That gives an indication, I suppose, of the distrust in feeding unusual or unnatural products to livestock, and it's been a bit of a PR disaster. How do you think this product would go down?
With the amanthamine, the daffodil extract, of course, we have some advantages. It's a natural extract, so it's a plant extract. We will obviously have to do the work to prove it safe, and that will be the next 3 years' work for us. The early signs are that we'll see productivity benefits. And one of the challenges with Bovaer is very effective at reducing methane, but very little in it for the farmer. We reckon with the results we've got, we would have finished those animals 50 days earlier. They'd have gone off the farm 50 days before.
That's significant.
And that's a significant profit margin for the farmer, and obviously a reduction in emissions because they're not on the farm to be emitting.
The project's called Dancing with Daffodils.
Yeah.
Now that has to be the most poetic name I've ever seen for scientific work. And there's even a quote from Wordsworth on one of the releases I saw. It's a bit incongruous when you're talking about methane, is it not?
No, my family farm in the Lake District.
So you're responsible?
I was responsible. I spent a lot of time in my childhood with Wordsworth poetry.
The poetic Dr. Jamie Newbold from SRUC. Well, as I say, in its latest report, the Climate Change Committee calls for a transformation in UK agriculture. The CCC advises the UK government on ways to reduce emissions to meet net zero by 2050. Its 7th report sets out a plan from 2038 to 2042, and it recommends a 27% drop in the number of cattle and sheep, and that we all eat less meat. It wants to see more woodlands, more peatlands re-wetted, and more energy crops like miscanthus being grown. Now, for this report, the CCC set up an agricultural advisory group, and its report argues that well-managed livestock bring multiple benefits, pointing out that meat produced in the UK has lower emissions than that produced in some other countries. It calls for better data and more help for farmers adapting to the realities of climate change, from flooding to disease, while margins are low and prices and output volatile. Emma Pinchbeck runs the Climate Change Committee.
Right now, agriculture is not the biggest problem in the economy. What we're talking about in terms of delivery for the next 5 to 10 years is really focused on heat and transport and clean power and other areas of the economy. But by the time of this carbon budget, agriculture is a bigger remaining issue in the economy. And so we're talking about agriculture to sort of get ready for the late 2030s and early 2040s.
Now, this time round, you had an agriculture advisory group. I think it's fair to say they're not quite on board. They talk about the benefits of livestock, that it's better to produce meat here than in some other places and then export it. You don't agree, I'm assuming? We
actually do agree with that. One of the messages in the report very clearly, having worked with farmers quite closely in the development of the advice, is that we see farmers and landowners as important to providing the solutions of the future. And what we've tried to do is look at land use in the round so that wherever livestock might be coming out of farms, there are alternative revenue streams, whether that's growing biocrop, having some role in tree planting in some way, or indeed having renewable energy on your farm. And collectively, we think that the net benefit of that to farms in the UK is about £1,000 to £1,500 per acre.
But you are talking about a 27% drop in the number of cattle and sheep, aren't you? And as the group points out, that transition is difficult.
We are talking about a change in livestock numbers, yes. And what's important about that is the change in livestock numbers actually comes from a change in diets, and some of that change we've already seen happening. Over the last 5 years, there's been about a 9% reduction in meat eating.
There has been a fairly furious response from some parts of the farming industry to this. The Tenants Farmers Association highlighted that agriculture produces 12% of the UK's emissions, but it uses 70% of the land, and it doesn't think you've taken that sort of balance into account enough.
What I will say is we have really genuinely tried to consider things in balance. For livestock, for land use overall, things like crop production, biocrops, but also crops of food. In our numbers, food production from the UK stays the same. So we've tried to keep food security as it is and to keep the same balance of imports and exports.
I suppose by the time we get to 2038, we've done the easy things. So in lots of different sectors of the economy, we're making difficult decisions at this point.
Absolutely that. And in the report, for agriculture and for aviation and shipping and some other sectors of the economy that are trickier, we're more agnostic about some of the solutions coming forward, because there are things that will emerge that will surprise us, that will help all of this over the next 10 years. What we've got to do, though, is come up with at least a credible pathway for being able to say to government, we're confident you can get this level of emissions out of the economy. We are trying to, I suppose, help farmers and bits of the economy by offering them a guide to the kinds of things that they might be asked to do.
Although they hate being lumped in with aviation, as they will no doubt be shouting at the radio right now, you don't need to fly, but you do need to eat.
I think a really good change in our analysis is we are specifically not doing that. So we are treating land use as an entire sector, and we're actually saying to the aviation industry, they need to clean up their own mess and they should be responsible for investing in expensive offsetting technologies like greenhouse gas removals, whereas farmers, who are stewards of the land, should be the people that get to do tree planting, peatland restoration, soil restoration, and they should be the ones rewarded for doing so, because that helps them with then the changes to livestock numbers.
Emma Pinchbeck from the Climate Change Committee. And that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.